Broadcasting from New York City to the world, it's the G-Man Interviews.
Welcome. My guest for this installment is Rick Black, Director for Americans Against Abusive Probate Guardianship, also known as AAAPG. Mr. Black left his job as an executive of a global textile company in early 2015 and now devotes himself to volunteering for guardianship reforms on a full-time basis. He has investigated over 400 suspected fraudulent guardianship cases throughout the country as the intake specialist for the organization and has coined the phrase isolate the victim, defame legitimate family, and liquidate the estate to describe the hallmarks of fraudulent guardianships. He has also exposed corruption in probate courts across the nation and helped thousands that fell victim to fraudulent guardianships. In March of this year, he spoke at the National Forum for Financial Exploitation by Conservators, which was sponsored by the National Center for State Courts and the Department of Justice. Mr. Black actively lobbies in Washington, D.C. for improved protections for vulnerable adults and was pivotal in promoting S-178, the Elder Abuse Protection and Prosecution Act, the nation's first adult guardianship oversight bill. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the show, Mr. Black.
Thank you.
For listeners that may not be familiar with this issue, could you explain what fraudulent guardianships and probate courts are?
Sure. In our country, we have a lot of protections for those who become vulnerable. In most cases, the protections rely with your family, and they have the privilege, and it's actually protected by law, to be able, as a spouse or a parent or a child or a sibling, they have the right to provide as a caregiver, as a legal representative for a loved one. In certain circumstances, however, each state regulates this differently. All states have created probate courts or other general jurisdiction courts where guardianships are established. And the establishment of a guardianship removes all of your rights to residence, association, to decision-making, and removes your estate from you and places it in the hands of a third party, which is called a guardian. And again, that is normally done in probate court. If the exchange of the estate occurs while you're still living, that's called a guardianship. If it occurs after you have died, that's referred to as probate, and that's where the distribution of your estate goes to your designated heirs. The cases that we follow at Americans Against Abusive Probate Guardianship, and where we aid families who are victimized by the process, are those that we call fraudulent guardianships. And fraudulent guardianships are those that are initiated by allies of the court, because this all has to be done in a court environment. It is created by the orders of the judge, but it's those guardianships that are established purely for the purpose of financially exploiting the ward or the alleged incapacitated person.
Your personal experience with this issue began in 2013.
Yeah. What started in June of 2013 has forever changed my family, both financially, emotionally, and psychologically. My father-in-law had retired in Las Vegas, Nevada, roughly 10 years prior. He was renting from a family friend by the name of Helen Natko, who we had all known for nearly 30 years. She had left the Pittsburgh area and had moved to Las Vegas in 1992, had bought her own home, and had started asking my father-in-law to come out and help her out and live with her and escape the winters of Pittsburgh and enjoy the environment in Las Vegas. Although my father-in-law wasn't a gambler, he had many friends who had retired in Las Vegas, several who were working jobs at the casinos, so he gave it a shot. What we didn't realize, even though we talked to him every week, and visited with him at least once every year, was his mind had begun to fail due to Alzheimer's. He was not admitting it to us, and she was certainly working at deceiving us on what was going on. And in the summer of 2013, we learned that she had stolen $220,000 from him. When we approached him, because my wife had been on his bank accounts for years, actually about 5 years before he decided to move to Las Vegas, he denied that any money had been moved. She was eavesdropping on the call and immediately went into hysterics, that yelling at him to tell them, you moved that money for you moved that money for us, and ultimately you moved that money for me. And with that, we said, look, we're going to come out and we got to resolve this and help Dad. And she screamed, you come get your dad or I'll put him on a plane. And it got very, very ugly. Well, 24 hours later, we were in Las Vegas. We announced ourselves as we left the airport. We had a one-way ticket for Terry's dad. My wife's name is Terry, to bring him back to North Carolina where we could protect him. And we were informed that we would not be able to see him or speak to him. And we called the local police, and we asked them to engage. We showed them the forged checks because we'd done a lot of research over the previous 48 hours. We showed them the forged checks. We showed them the fraud. We talked about the isolation. The police met us at this woman's home, but because Dad would not leave the home, she would not let him leave. He came to the door, but he was so confused and disheveled. We knew that he was in distress, but because it was her home and the police refused to engage and he refused to leave, we were never able to get access to him. The police instructed us that they felt it was a civil matter, a family matter, even though we made it very clear she's not family and this is theft. They refused to engage, and they instructed us to go to family court and file for guardianship, which was their view that this is how this gets resolved. That commenced an odyssey that roughly 10,000 families each year are thrown into across the United States, and it's an odyssey that completely bewilders any law-abiding, loving family member, because you are being exploited. You know your loved one's being exploited. You're trying to protect them, and then you find the system that has been designated to protect them actually works to further exploit them. We did file for guardianship. The judge refused to recognize our petition. He lobbied with the landlord to file her own objection, which she did with the help of 3 local attorneys. At the first hearing, the judge inserted a local professional guardian to aid in resolving the matter, as he quoted it. That experience went on for a year, with very expensive litigation and discovery, and then he scheduled what they call an evidentiary hearing, which was a 12-day trial, which is extremely lengthy, all being paid by myself or my father-in-law in these cases. And at the end of the trial, he awarded full guardianship to the landlord, who at that point had kept him hostage for over a year. In that entire year, we were never able to remove him from the home. We were never able to take him out to dinner. We were never able to see or speak to him in private. There were always 2 or 3 chaperones that watched over everything we said. If we ever got even close to his treatment or the actions of any of the parties, the discussions were immediately ceased, and it cost him nearly his entire estate. He died a year after the guardianship was initiated, his foot black with gangrene due to a neglected infection. He never left the caregiver, landlord, guardian's home with us. He left many times with her. We had pictures from her taking him all over town so that she could enjoy pedicures and dinners and a bunch of different things at his expense, but we were never allowed to be with him alone or to remove him from the home. The intrigue on our case, which makes it unique, is 9 months into this odyssey, I took the same evidence that the guardianship judge continued to ignore, and I gave it to police. And they immediately launched an investigation and indicted the guardian in October of 2014, and she was convicted of felony theft and exploitation in April of 2017. So our story ends like this. It cost the family $1 million. It cost my father-in-law his entire estate and likely his life. It cost me $500,000, assuming that I could free him by continuing to fight this through the family court system. The guardian, ultimately, we prevailed in our position of June of 2013 in that we got her criminally convicted in April of 2017. But none of the money will be returned. It is clear this man was being exploited the last 4 or 5 years of his life as his mind began to fade. And still today, because we had our most recent hearing was the end of August, the family court continues to lay accolades on Miss Natko for her job as a guardian, and in fact gave her another $5,000 in August for room and board for the last 9 months that she held him hostage before his death, Dad that is, and thanked her for her service as a guardian as he absolved her of any wrongdoing in the guardianship case. So our odyssey continues in Vegas, but that's the story that got me into this. From that, because I could see this was a pattern of practice within that court, roughly the end of 2013, I started working with other families. I formed a victims coalition. I challenged the judiciary in 2014 on the pattern of practice, which they denied. In March of 2015, I took 30 case briefs to the Attorney General of Nevada, Adam Laxalt, met with his investigator, and they immediately launched an investigation statewide on corruption within the adult guardianship system. Since that time, we've gotten 3 judges removed from the bench, permanently barred from hearing adult guardianships. They're still working as judges, but at least not in adult guardianship. And we've gotten the arrests of 10, the convictions of 6, and the remaining 4 are headed to trial in May of 2018. And we have another 2 to 4 that are on our radar screen that have yet to be indicted, but we're hopeful that they do get indicted.
Did Natko receive support from the court and others because she had or has friends in high places or was a pillar of the community?
No, Gary. The scheme that we see played out, and for your listeners, I've investigated now roughly 500 cases of fraudulent guardianships nationwide. And the scheme that plays out is these court officers, those that work there every day, every week, and they are predominantly attorneys, but also guardians, they seek out the dysfunction within any relationship and familial relationships. If they find a party that they can represent as legitimate, in this case, they called Natko his wife. They had never been married. Nevada is not a common law state. There were no joint assets. The home was hers. They both had separate cars and titles. They both had separate bank accounts until he became incapacitated, and then she put her name on many of his assets and successfully moved those assets into her full and 100% control. The scheme that occurs here is they seek the guilty party, they legitimize the guilty party to get the judge to insert or create justification to create a professional guardianship, and that's all they really want is the conflict, because the conflict creates the funds flow. The allies of the court are paid from the estate of the alleged incapacitated person. And if the opposing party, in this case my wife and I, are willing to fight them, then other parties will join in knowing that they're going to get paid by the other side of the family, and everybody in the system makes money. So the priority of anyone in a guardianship adjudication court, whatever the name is around the country, in that local jurisdiction, everyone's priority is to establish a local guardianship, particularly over the assets, because once they control the assets, they will maintain that control until those assets are completely consumed, paying the parties of the court, the allies of the court.
I suspect people listening to your story are shocked that Helen Natko was only given 5 years probation after being convicted. What was your initial reaction to the ruling, and were you disappointed that she didn't receive a more stringent sentence?
I'll answer those backwards. Yes, we were disappointed, but we were also quite relieved. Throughout this whole event, we had 3 lawyers, a professional guardian, a doctor. There were many people that rallied to defend the integrity of a dysfunctional and corrupt system. And each of those folks had continually said that my wife and my claims were frivolous, that they were meritless. And that constant bombarding in court proceedings, in hearings, in letters, in communications, and especially after I ramped up my exposure in the media, I continued to be a target by even a greater circle of folks who wanted to make sure the illegitimate integrity of the system was maintained. So the criminal conviction after 4 years, sadly, I mean, they extracted $1 million from our family and untold emotional and psychological damage, but getting the criminal conviction legitimized and validated everything that I had been saying and had been representing for, at this point, 100 additional families to the public, to the media, and to elected officials. So we were quite relieved, to be honest, but also disappointed that she only got probation.
During the course of your investigations, which have been conducted nationwide, have you been able to determine any of the following? How long this has been going on, how much money has been lost or stolen, and how many seniors have been impacted?
This has been going on for thousands of years. Guardianship was established by the Greeks. It's talked about in Greek history. But in the U.S., this system has really, in many ways, elevated in its complexity, but also in its simplicity. The lawyers who control this environment, particularly over the last 30 years, have recognized that law enforcement will really not engage at all in wrongdoing within a power of attorney holder or a guardianship proceeding. They often deflect these cases to guardianship when questions of improprieties occur with power of attorney holders or trust agreements or other estate document executors. But once they are in guardianship, they always deflect them back to the guardianship court. So as a result, the predators who participate and initiate fraudulent guardianships have come to recognize over the last 30 years that they really only have to worry about the judge who gives them their powers. And if the judge is negligent or complicit, then they have really no worries at all. They can conduct financial exploitation under the guise of law, under the color of law within a guardianship, and really have carte blanche access and damage to an estate. So although it's a simple procedure, what we find is in most of these courtrooms, there is very poor attention to the rules of civil procedure, the rules of evidence, and state laws that protect the advance directives and estate documents of an individual. Today, instead of having an environment where they protect the law and the rights of the citizens, they in fact worked many times, more often than not sometimes, to further the exploitation. It's gotten worse over the last 30 years. How much money is lost or stolen? The National Center for State Courts reports that because no one keeps the data. This gives you a sense of the corruption as well. No state keeps the data on how many individuals are placed into guardianship, what their assets were or are at the time of conscription, and the annual accounting or expenditures and income of the guardian on an annual basis as that guardianship moves forward. The National Center for State Courts reports that in 2016, 1.3 million people, adults, were under guardianship nationwide, and approximately 176,000 were added to the rolls in that year. If you look at what the Federal Reserve reports as the average net worth of an individual of the age that would be put into guardianship, that represents $300 billion, with a B as in Bravo, $300 billion of assets that are transferred to third parties through guardianship. And on an annual basis, that represents approximately $50 billion that come into the system each year. When you recognize that there's only about 4,000 guardianship adjudication officers in the country and about 50,000 attorneys, that is a very, very lucrative amount of money that they have access to almost with impunity as to how they want to spend it within the guardianship system. So 1.3 million total today in the U.S., 176,000 added. Our analysis using U.S. Federal Reserve and MetLife and Bloomberg, many have validated this number. That puts approximately $300 billion in the control of guardians and an additional $50 billion coming into the system every year. What we see is on fraudulent guardianships, because fraudulent guardianships are generally targeted at high net worth retirees or actually adults, because it can happen to people with personal injury lawsuits as easily, which can be, they can be injured at birth and get a personal injury award. They can be injured in a car accident, and they can obviously retire and become, due to illness, dementia, Alzheimer's, can become susceptible to guardianship. Fraudulent guardianships are targeted at the wealthy. Their average net worth is much higher than the $300,000 that's identified in the Federal Reserve data that generates the $300 billion number. What we see is approximately $10 billion a year of familial assets are transferred to non-designated third parties strictly for the purpose of financial exploitation of a family through the guardianship process. And that's the estate of the victim as well as the assets of the family who desperately tries to free their loved one through the system that's clearly intent on furthering their exploitation. Our case is an example. My father-in-law lost his entire estate, $500,000. His care never improved. He never left the home of the person who was exploiting him when the proceedings commenced. And it cost me $500,000, primarily in legal fees, some in transportation. We live here in North Carolina, and we were flying out to Vegas at least every 2 months, either to see him or to participate in hearings in an attempt to free him. But the total damages to our family for just a 2-year guardianship was $1 million.
What agency or group do you blame most for allowing allegations of fraudulent guardianships and probate court abuse to go unchecked for so long?
No question, the Judicial. The Probate Court Judges Association has refused to take action or demand federal funds or other funds to clean up the atrocities. We continue to see them blaming this on lack of resources, lack of money. And the fact is there's billions of dollars that are available through block grants, through the Department of Health and Human Resources that are handed down to states via our federal income taxes. If they wanted to clean this up, they could clean it up very easily. I equate this often to an airline pilot. United Airlines pilot today, mid-level pilot, is going to make $230 an hour. That's only paid when the wheels are up and when he's in the air. So his travel back and forth to the airport and doing his reports, he's not paid for that. He's paid when the wheels are up and he's in the air and he's protecting 100 to 400 passengers in the back of his plane. A pilot never starts those engines without going through a full checklist and making sure that every precaution that's provided to him through the design of that plane and the systems that are incorporated, he makes sure that he never forgets or misses those protections because of the importance of the people in that plane. In the case of probate judges, we often see that the precautions, the rules of civil procedure within a state, the statutes, that very good statutes that are created in each state in the United States, they often are completely ignored. And when family comes to try to remind them of their obligations, they also completely ignore it. So there's no question that the probate judges understand the risks. When they make a mistake, particularly in guardianship proceedings, that is the most important decision that they can possibly make. They are making the decision to remove a person's rights, their civil rights, their unalienable rights, their rights to church, their rights to residence, their rights to association, and their rights to their estate. That is every bit as important, although it only affects one, but many, because the family is all affected by it as well. That decision deserves the same due process as when a pilot gets into the cockpit of a plane. And guardians are paid the same as a pilot, even though they don't have to have anything more. They don't even have to have a high school education. The certification for getting guardianship oftentimes is just having an attorney that says you're qualified. You only have to be 18 years old. You only have to have an attorney who vouches for you, and you can be given the control over another party, complete control over them and their estate. And to think these guardians pay themselves, I've seen a low of $130 an hour, and I've seen a high of $300 an hour. I've seen them pay themselves for a single ward as much as 12 hours in a single day, $200 an hour to open letters, to deal with phone calls, to leave messages, to go over and empty the trash, which they shouldn't have to do because you have trash service, to go over and inspect their homes even though they're living there. It's amazing when you look at the annual accountings of guardians what they justify that they need to do at $150 to $300 an hour when it's stuff that could, one, it's unnecessary, but two, it could be easily handled by less costly means. But because these courts don't police the billings of the guardians and they embrace any opportunity to create a guardianship, the arrogance amongst the parties to continue to bill at will has only increased.
Could you provide an overview of the Elder Abuse Protection and Prosecution Act?
Yeah. Senate Bill 178, the Elder Abuse Protection and Prosecution Act, its precursor started in roughly 2011 by Senator Amy Klobuchar out of Minnesota. Minnesota I hold in high esteem because they have done the best job of any state nationwide to try to corral abuses within the guardianship system. In 2012, they created their Conservator Audit and Accounting Program, CAP, and it's managed by a former Canadian Mountie by the name of Kate Boyko, and they review all expenses, inventories, etc., of guardianship spending, receipts and expenses of guardianships once they're established in Minnesota courts. In 2016, she testified at the U.S. Senate Special Committee on Aging on the topic of fraudulent guardianships and guardianship abuse. And in that presentation, she highlighted that approximately 13% of the cases that they audit every year the transgressions are of a serious enough matter that they forward them on for criminal investigation and prosecution by local law enforcement. In early 2017, she issued a follow-up report, and now that number for referrals for law enforcement investigations has risen to approximately 23%. I highlight those numbers, Gary, because Minnesota is doing, I think, the best job. They know they have gaps, but they're doing the best job of really providing a census and providing some oversight on the downstream activities of the guardians. So if the judge is negligent or complicit, you at least have the opportunity and backstop of catching that fraud in the financial management of the assets downstream. The fact that Kate is highlighting that criminal referrals have nearly doubled from one year to the next, and 4 years into their incorporation of CAP into their statewide approach is alarming. And if a system that is given this level of oversight is seeing 23% of the cases being forwarded for criminal investigations, what do we think is occurring, or the occurrence of criminal activity in guardianships where there is no oversight? And what I learned in Nevada, which was confirmed, less than 5% of all the cases statewide that were audited in 2015 showed that they were compliant with state law. So it was clear that corruption within the system was accommodated by the judges then. It continues to be accommodated in Nevada today. And in Michigan, where they're or Minnesota rather, where they're putting stringent requirements on it, it's growing as well. So we do have a major issue with oversight in the guardianship system in each local jurisdiction, each county, each state in the country. And Senate Bill 178, the Elder Abuse Protection and Prosecution Act, when signed by the president, or if and when it becomes law, would be the first federal law that assigns Department of Justice, FBI investigators in each of the 94 judicial districts, federal judicial districts in the country, both one from a financial perspective, the FTC would assign an investigator, and the DOJ would assign an investigator. So we would come out of this bill with 188 additional investigators for elder abuse, and it would also provide the first opportunity for federal investigators to look into guardianship cases and ensure the protections of those individuals nationwide. So it's an important milestone because there have been nearly 25 bills that have died in either the House or the Senate over the last 30 years. It's clear that the states don't want federal intervention in state legal matters. The probate judges don't want the oversight. The American Bar Association and their state bar associations have fought this vehemently, that they've got this under control, there's nothing to see here, move along, and yet the cases of malfeasance and criminal activity continue to grow. And obviously the National Guardianship Association, which is a designated lobbying group for professionals, also wants no further federal intervention. So we're hoping that the president signs that bill by the end of the year. We're encouraged with the progress that we've made, particularly over the last 18 months after this bill languished in various forms from 2011 to 2015. But hopefully there will be some relief for the folks that would be targeted in the future.
What suggestions would you give to seniors to prevent them from becoming victims?
Stay out of probate court. The environment is too perverted today to have any confidence that they're going to protect you or your loved one or the heirs. What we recommend to everyone is be close in proximity. One, have your estate documents executed. A power of attorney, a healthcare advance directive. Those are two unique tools. One is it protects you on financial decisions. The other gives the authority for medical and personal decisions over you should you become incapacitated due to injury or illness. Have your will executed. That's downstream upon passing, but it's important as well. In your advanced healthcare directive, ensure that you designate who you want to be your guardian if a third party steps in trying to enforce one, because lawyers will often step in, hospitals will often step in to try to appoint a third party, and you want to have those documents there that help to protect you so that the person who you trust, who you have confidence in, is granted that privilege. Secondly is proximity. So get your estate documents in order, make sure they're executed and notarized, and then proximity, be within 30 minutes of your loved one, because in almost all these cases, not all, but in almost all, there is distance, at least an hour's driving time, sometimes thousands of miles, between your designated estate executor and your location. And distance gives these people a great advantage. Most of these cases are initiated ex parte. And ex parte is when a party files with the court and is not required to notice or give anyone the opportunity to object to the claims that they're making to a judge. When you live 1,000 miles away and you're talking to your parent or your loved one once a week or once every couple of weeks, it gives those ex parte filings so much more leverage. They can go to the judge. They can get the order signed within hours. They can get the bank accounts all converted. The guardian at that point can get all the bank accounts converted to their control. They can remove you from your home, and they do that quite often. They send you to a lockdown psych unit where you now are isolated, and they proceed to go through your entire home to find all of your estate documents, any collectibles that are there, petty cash, and completely clean you out. And then when they ultimately file their initial inventory with the court, they'll say that you're destitute, that there was nothing in the home, there was nothing of value. And most importantly, now all of a sudden, you will have no will, you will have no power of attorney, you will have no healthcare advance directive. So if you're not executing those agreements, giving them to the people you love and trust, and keeping them close, you can become very susceptible to this type of exploitation. And the group of people, Gary, that I most fear for, because the baby boomers, those people who had no children, are quickly moving into the age of vulnerability. And when you've willed your assets to philanthropic organizations or third parties, or you have not told those parties of your intentions, you now become completely susceptible to the predators who have gained control of these courtrooms.
How can people contact you or your organization for more information?
Our organization is on the web at AAAPG.net, and that's Americans Against Abusive Probate Guardianship. We also have phone numbers there that you can call. For the last year and a half, I've been doing all the intake across the country. So anyone who calls and just wants a voice to talk to, who understands this issue and will be intentional in aiding them, 95% of the calls will end up coming to my cell phone. But we are 24/7. My wife scolds me often on, you're not getting paid anything for this. Can we shut it down at somewhere around 80 hours a week? And I do try to do that, but this has become sort of a 24/7 initiative, and we do like to be available for those victims because, sadly, as we learned and as many others have learned, there really is no backstop. You cannot get the help from the people who are collecting federal funds in law enforcement, in elder protection, to truly take a stand to protect family core values, estate documents, and state law. And, we feel in many ways privileged that we can provide that assistance to people.
People can make donations through the site as well?
They can. We have a PayPal account that we list on the site, but in every case that comes in, I summarize the detail and confirm those details with the party, and then we provide the opportunity for them to submit donations to our website as well. We live on donations. I've yet to make a penny from this, nor has any of the other directors, but we're hopeful that if we gain more recognition that we can get some grant money to expand and continue the effort. But at this point, every penny goes right back into just keeping the website going and keeping it visible.
Is there anything you want to say in closing?
Yeah, just, to the listeners who've been touched by this, because there's many that have, I just beg of them to speak out and speak up to your local elected officials. You're there in the New York market, and we have a number of victims who've called from the New York market. I'm working with a 19-year-old cerebral palsy victim currently there on Staten Island that 3 days before he turned 18, 3 nefarious attorneys filed ex parte for guardianship over him, claiming that he needed further protections because of the estate that he had won due to a botched birth, and that since his parents had recently divorced, they were better able to care for him than his mom, who had been caring for him his entire life. We see tie-ins with the Vera Institute there in Manhattan with the court systems, Manhattan, Richmond, Brooklyn, where we see additional suspect activities. And the only way that we're ever going to put a stop to this is having good families, designated family members, speak up and speak out to federal officials, because the states have really not done a good job of making sure that what occurs in these courtrooms is consistent with state law. I just want to beg of them, get in touch with AAAPG, get in touch with your elected officials. Now is the time to talk about these atrocities, and let's try to get elected officials, law enforcement, to take action to put a stop to it, or at least put a big dent in it to protect others moving forward.
Thank you for joining me and sharing this information, Mr. Black. I greatly appreciate it. You and your wife take care.
Thanks, Gary.
Before closing, it should be noted that this interview was conducted on October 17th of this year. On October 18th, President Donald Trump signed Bill S-178, the Elder Abuse Protection and Prosecution Act, into law. Thank you for joining me. Until next time, stay cool, stay safe, and stay informed.